My name is Bridget, a 29-year-old woman living in Savannah, yet everything I owned felt fragile at that very moment. Inside the house I paid for my sister was devouring the expensive steak I had bought while mocking my struggles with weight. Her voice was filled with entitlement as she spoke on the phone about how I was just a fat girl weighing 92 kilos. Who would be afraid of her, a fat girl weighing 92 kilos? I am the owner of this house, my sister proclaimed, before letting out a cruel laugh. Instead of starting a meaningless shouting match with a woman intoxicated by her own arrogance, I chose to remain absolutely silent while processing the depth of her betrayal. My mind remained sharp despite the betrayal because I knew a direct confrontation would only result in a messy scene that solved nothing. I quietly backed away from the porch, walking toward my car parked on the street, where I locked myself inside the dark interior. With trembling fingers, I made a single life-changing phone call to my father to initiate a sequence of events that could never be reversed. Exactly 2 hours later, the woman who claimed to own my home would find herself begging for mercy while fleeing down the stairs with her tail between her legs. Revenge that will keep you on your seat. Please remember to subscribe while clicking the notification bell so you never miss a moment of how this arrogant parasite paid for her treachery. 3 weeks prior, a heavy rain washed over Savannah, bringing an unexpected and miserable guest to my doorstep. I opened the door to find my sister Hazel shivering under the dim porch light with 4 oversized suitcases piled haphazardly around her feet. Her mascara was smeared across her cheeks while she sobbed about how her landlord had evicted her after her mounting debts finally caught up with her. Despite the tension that had defined our relationship for years, I could not leave my own flesh and blood out in the storm, so I dragged her heavy luggage into the hallway. I spent the next hour preparing the guest room while Hazel complained about the humidity in Georgia and the lack of space in my house. I made it very clear that this arrangement was strictly temporary because I had worked extremely hard to afford this property on my own. I told her that she needed to keep the common areas clean and contribute to the grocery expenses until she could find a new job. Hazel nodded quickly while promising to follow every single rule I laid out, yet her eyes were already wandering around the living room as if she were appraising the furniture. The initial sympathy I felt for Hazel evaporated within the first few days when her true nature began to resurface. I would leave for the office at 6 in the morning only to return 10 hours later to find the kitchen counter covered in sticky soda spills and crusty dinner plates. My sister spent her entire day lounging on my velvet sofa while watching reality television instead of looking for employment opportunities as she had promised. The house that I usually kept in pristine condition started looking like a chaotic storage unit because her clothes were strewn across every available surface. Whenever I asked her to help with the basic household chores, she would claim that she was too emotionally exhausted from her recent bankruptcy to hold a vacuum cleaner. I found myself washing her dirty laundry and scrubbing the bathtub just so I could have a functional home to rest in after my grueling shifts. Our conversations became shorter as the days passed, because I realized that my sister had no intention of respecting the boundaries I had established. The financial strain of the situation became a significant burden when I noticed that the grocery bills were doubling every week. While I was carefully budgeting my salary to cover the mortgage and utility payments, Hazel was coming home with expensive shopping bags from high-end boutiques downtown. She claimed that she was using the last of her savings to maintain a professional appearance for potential interviews, but the tags on the dresses told a much different story. I watched her unwrap designer shoes while she ignored my request for her to contribute $40 toward the electricity bill. Her sense of entitlement was baffling because she acted as if my hard-earned success was a collective family resource that she could tap into at any time. Every time I mentioned her spending habits, she would skillfully redirect the conversation to make me feel like I was being a controlling or unsupportive sibling. The most painful part of the intrusion was the psychological warfare that Hazel began to wage against me during our evening meals. She would sit across from me at the dinner table while scrutinizing every bite of food I took, with a look of feigned concern on her face. Hazel started making subtle comments about how my metabolism must be slowing down now that I was approaching 30, because she noticed my clothes were fitting differently. She would laugh softly while suggesting that perhaps I should skip the dessert I had prepared, because a girl of my size needed to be more careful. These remarks were not accidental observations, but were calculated attempts to chip away at my self-esteem, so that she could maintain a position of power in the household. She frequently reminded me that I weighed 92 kilos while she remained as slim as she was in high school, using my physical appearance as a weapon to justify her condescending attitude. I remained silent during these insults because I did not want to give her the satisfaction of seeing me hurt, even though her words felt like cold water being thrown in my face. 2 weeks later, the situation deteriorated rapidly as a complete stranger began treating my living room like his personal hotel. My best friend Chloe dropped by for coffee on a Tuesday afternoon, only to stop dead in her tracks at the sight of my transformed hallway. She stared at the trail of muddy footprints leading directly to the white rug that I had spent months saving for during my first year in this house. The air in my home was thick with the smell of cheap cologne and stale beer that certainly did not belong to my sister. Chloe looked at me with genuine concern while pointing at the overflowing trash can and the pile of dirty gym clothes on the dining table. "Your kindness is feeding a bunch of parasites, Bridget," Chloe warned me with a sharp edge to her voice before she grabbed her purse to leave. She told me that allowing Hazel to stay was one thing, but letting her bring a permanent guest was a recipe for a total disaster. I had recently discovered that the stranger was my sister's boyfriend, Seth, whom she had invited to live in my house, without uttering a single word of notice to me. Hazel simply introduced him as the love of her life during breakfast, while he was casually eating the expensive organic eggs I had purchased for my weekly meal prep. Seth spent his afternoon sprawled across my leather recliner with his boots on, while shouting at the television during various sporting events. I noticed that my utility bills had nearly tripled within 10 days because they left the air conditioning running at full blast even when they were out for a long afternoon walk. The refrigerator was constantly empty of anything nutritious, as they consumed every ounce of high-quality groceries I brought home from the expensive market down the street. I felt like a total stranger in my own residence because I had to negotiate for a turn in the bathroom while Seth took 40-minute showers every single morning with the water running hot. When I finally summoned the courage to ask her to contribute to the rising living expenses, Hazel immediately burst into loud, dramatic sobbing. She threw herself onto the sofa while accusing me of being a cold-hearted person who did not understand the meaning of true family support. Hazel claimed that I was only being difficult because I was miserable in my own solitary life and felt envious of the happiness she found with her new partner. "He is the love of my life. Can't you support your family a little? Or are you just jealous of me?" Hazel shouted while gesturing toward the silent man who refused to make eye contact with me. I stood there watching her dramatic display, while realizing that any attempt at a rational conversation was completely futile at this point. Seth simply continued to scroll through his phone while ignoring the chaos he was causing in the very place that provided him with free shelter and food. The realization that my sister was actively sabotaging my peace of mind made me shift my strategy from accommodation to self-preservation. I spent that evening installing a new deadbolt on my bedroom door so that I could at least have one secure space to retreat from their constant noise. I gathered my extra credit cards and my social security documents from the home office to hide them inside a small, heavy safe that I kept at the back of my dark closet. My trust in Hazel was officially gone because her behavior proved that she viewed me as nothing more than a convenient bank account for her and her incredibly lazy boyfriend. I started eating most of my meals in my car or at the local park, just to avoid the toxic atmosphere that had permeated every corner of my beautiful Savannah home. Every interaction with them became a test of my patience as I prepared myself for the inevitable moment when I would have to take my house back from these entitled intruders. That Friday evening exhaustion weighed heavy on my shoulders as I returned home early, completely unprepared for the chaos inside. As I pulled my sedan into the driveway, I immediately heard the rhythmic thumping of heavy bass vibrating through the sturdy walls of my Savannah cottage. My heart sank when I stepped onto the wide porch, because the peaceful sanctuary I had worked so hard to maintain was clearly being violated by uninvited guests. I stayed close to the side of the house while peering through the large glass window to witness nearly a dozen strangers lounging on my expensive furniture. Hazel was twirling in the center of the room with a bottle of my most vintage wine in her hand, while she laughed at some unheard joke with a stranger. The living room looked like a disorganized tavern because empty beer cans were scattered across the antique mantelpiece, along with my delicate cream-colored rugs. Seth was sprawled across the velvet sofa with his muddy boots resting on the cushions, while he encouraged the crowd to drink more of the supplies I had bought for the week. "Make yourselves at home, everyone, because my house is your house, so please do not mind my cranky younger sister who usually hides in the back room with her calculators." Hazel shouted over the music while she gestured mockingly toward my private living quarters. I watched the strangers laugh and cheer as they treated my personal belongings with absolute contempt, while ignoring the fact that they were intruders in a private residence. I shifted my gaze toward the backyard through the kitchen door and noticed thick smoke rising from the high-end charcoal grill I had purchased last summer for my own quiet weekends. A group of men stood around the fire while watching several thick cuts of premium ribeye steak sizzle and pop on the metal grates. My stomach knotted since I realized those were the exact steaks I had carefully selected as a reward for finally finishing a month of grueling overtime at the office. Seth walked toward the grill and slapped one of the men on the back while holding a plate already piled high with my homemade side dishes and artisan bread. "This is top-grade beef, everyone, because my girlfriend really knows how to pamper me with the best things in life without a second thought for the cost." Seth laughed while taking a massive bite of the food that I had paid for with my own hard-earned salary. I felt a cold wave of clarity wash over my initial impulse to scream, because I knew that rushing inside would only lead to a pointless confrontation with a drunken mob of people. I took a slow, deep breath and stepped back into the shadows of the porch, where the warm light from the windows could no longer reach my frustrated face. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and adjusted the camera settings to ensure that the footage I was recording captured every undeniable detail of the ongoing destruction. I needed to document every single face along with every piece of property being ruined so that there would be no room for lies or excuses when the authorities eventually arrived. My hands remained steady even though my chest felt tight with the weight of this calculated betrayal by someone I had once tried to save from her own financial ruin. I realized the woman inside was no longer the sister I once loved, but a predator who viewed my home and my hard work as her personal hunting ground. I decided to remain a silent witness for a few more minutes while I waited for the perfect moment to execute the next phase of my counterattack. My eyes scanned the room to identify the most intoxicated individuals, while I mentally mapped out the quickest way to clear my home once the help I called for arrived. Moments later, a shrill voice drifted through the slightly open window, completely severing any remaining ties of sisterhood. Hazel separated herself from the roaring crowd in the living room while walking toward the kitchen window with her phone pressed tightly against her ear. I stood perfectly still behind the thick jasmine bushes because the darkness provided the perfect cover for me to witness her private betrayal. She leaned against the counter and began laughing while she recounted a completely fictional version of our living arrangement to whoever was on the other end of the line. Hazel claimed with absolute confidence that she had finally used her own earnings to purchase this beautiful Savannah property. She went even further by describing me as a burden she was forced to carry because of my supposed lack of ambition and poor health. Her voice lacked any trace of the gratitude she had shown when I first opened my door to her. I am honestly exhausted with the responsibility of maintaining this entire house, but she is my sister, so I cannot just abandon that fat girl weighing 92 kilos. Hazel sighed into the receiver. I watched her through the glass as she swirled the red liquid in her glass while her eyes gleamed with a predatory light. Her face was illuminated by the kitchen light, which made the cruel smirk on her lips appear even sharper than usual. She continued her conversation by explaining how Seth was the only person who truly understood the pressure of living with such a miserable and demanding sibling. Hazel shared her malicious plan to manipulate me into signing several legal documents that would allow her to mortgage my home for their new business venture. She described me as nothing more than a mindless ATM that existed solely to fund her lifestyle, while she plotted to steal the roof over my head. The calculated nature of her scheme proved that she had never intended to find a job or move out because she felt entitled to everything I owned. She is just a submissive ATM for us, and I am going to take the rest of her savings to secure the future for Seth and me, without her ever knowing what happened. Hazel laughed without a shred of guilt. I reached into my pocket and slowly pulled out my smartphone to activate the recording application, while my heart hammered against my ribs. My hands remained perfectly stable as I captured every single word of her fraudulent claims. Every sentence she spoke became another heavy nail in the coffin of our relationship, as I realized that the woman I grew up with was officially gone forever. I stopped looking at her as a family member and started viewing her as a dangerous intruder who needed to be removed from my property immediately. The recording continued to run for several more minutes, while she boasted about her ability to keep me under her thumb for as long as she needed. I remained hidden in the shadows until the call ended because I wanted to be absolutely certain that I had enough information to convince my father. My decision was final as I stepped away from the kitchen window to begin the next phase of reclaiming my life and my home. The air felt cold against my face while I focused on the practical steps required to sever this toxic connection once and for all. I knew that the time for mercy had long since passed because Hazel had already declared war on my livelihood and my sanity with her own spoken words. There would be no more second chances for someone who was willing to leave me homeless for the sake of a lazy man and a failing business dream. Stepping back to my car without making a single sound, I made a swift and ruthless decision to end this nightmare. I moved away from the porch while keeping my footsteps light on the gravel driveway to avoid alerting the noisy crowd that was still celebrating inside. My sedan sat quietly under the shadow of a large oak tree 50 yards away from the front entrance where the streetlights could not reach. Once I sat behind the steering wheel, I pulled the door shut with a muffled click and locked all the exits to create a soundproof barrier against the chaotic music. I took a few minutes to regulate my breathing while the interior of the car filled with a cold silence that felt like a relief after the noise. I tapped the screen of my smartphone to access the live feed from the 4 hidden security cameras I had secretly installed in the living room last Saturday afternoon. The high-definition footage displayed Hazel laughing while she carelessly poured wine onto my expensive rug, while Seth rested his dirty feet on my grandmother's mahogany coffee table. Seeing the destruction in real time through the lens of my phone solidified my resolve to never allow these people near my property ever again. I watched as Seth handed a plate of my stolen food to a stranger who was currently spilling grease on the armchair I had bought with my first major promotion. The cameras captured every detail of their blatant disrespect, which provided me with the undeniable evidence I needed to justify my upcoming actions. I felt a surge of cold fury while watching Hazel mock my appearance again to a group of men who were currently occupying my dining room. I took a long breath to steady my nerves before scrolling through my contacts to find the one person who could truly handle this level of betrayal. My father Warren answered on the second ring with his usual stern tone, while I maintained a voice as cold as ice during the entire conversation. I did not allow any trembling or weakness to creep into my words, because I needed him to understand the gravity of the situation at hand. My father had always been a man of strict principles, who believed that family loyalty was something to be earned through honesty and hard work. I knew that hearing about Hazel's plan to steal my home would be the final straw for him after years of covering her previous financial failures. Dad, Hazel is destroying my house and plotting to steal my money for her useless boyfriend. I need you here right now, I stated firmly while watching my sister on the screen. I explained the situation with clinical precision while avoiding any emotional outbursts that might cloud the facts of the ongoing trespassing and theft. I ended the call and immediately began selecting the most damning clips from the last hour of footage to send directly to his messaging app. The videos clearly showed Hazel discussing her plan to mortgage the house, along with Seth's blatant disregard for my personal belongings and house rules. I knew my father would react with the same sense of justice that had guided our family for decades because he valued integrity above everything else in his life. I am on my way with the spare key. Do not do anything until I am there. Let me handle this, Warren replied through a text message that appeared at the top of my screen just seconds later. I leaned back against the leather seat of my car while my eyes remained fixed on the glowing screen that displayed the ongoing party in my living room. I felt a strange sense of detachment while I watched the strangers celebrate their temporary victory in the house that I had built with my own blood and sweat. I began counting down the minutes while imagining the look of sheer terror that would cross Hazel's face when the true authority finally stepped through the front door. The darkness of the car interior felt safe compared to the toxic environment inside the house, where my sister continued to mock my existence to her drunken friends. Every minute that passed brought me closer to the moment when the locks would be changed and the police would be called to clear out the remaining trash. I took a deep breath to settle the remaining adrenaline while preparing to follow him into the battlefield that my home had become. I knew that by the time the sun rose over Savannah tomorrow morning, my sister would finally understand the true cost of her greed and her insults. Exactly 2 hours later, the glaring headlights of a heavy SUV pierced the darkness of my driveway, signaling the end of the party. The engine growled as the vehicle came to a sudden halt right in front of the wide porch where I had been waiting patiently in my car. I watched through the windshield as my father Warren stepped out with a grim expression that told me he had watched every single video I sent him. I climbed out of my sedan and met him at the base of the stairs while he nodded silently to acknowledge my presence before we marched toward the front door together. The vibrations of the music were still shaking the wooden structure, but my father did not hesitate to use his spare key to swing the door open with a force that made the nearby decorations rattle. We walked directly into the center of the living room while the smell of smoke and cheap alcohol hit us like a physical wall. Warren did not say a word at first because he walked straight to the sound system and pulled the power cord from the wall with a sharp yank to stop the noise. The sudden silence was deafening while the guests, frozen in mid-motion, looked toward the door with expressions of utter confusion and fear. Hazel was standing near the fireplace with a half-empty glass of wine while she stared at our father, as if she had just seen a ghost from her past. Seth attempted to stand up from the sofa while adjusting his shirt, though the look in my father's eyes made him sink back into the cushions immediately. "Dad, why are you here at this hour since we were just having a small party to catch up and celebrate our recent success?" Hazel stammered while her face turned a ghostly shade of pale. My father ignored her attempt at a warm greeting while he stood in the center of the room like an unmovable mountain of righteous anger. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the printed records of the mounting debts that Hazel had tried so desperately to hide from the rest of the family. Warren began detailing her financial betrayals with a booming voice that carried over the hushed whispers of the terrified strangers who were now looking for the nearest exit. He declared that every cent of family support was being cut off immediately because she had proven herself to be a dishonest and manipulative person who did not deserve our help. The air in the room felt heavy with the weight of her exposed secrets, while Hazel struggled to find a single lie that could save her from this public humiliation. My daughter's house is not a free hotel for people like you and this lazy boyfriend, so every single one of you needs to get out of here right now. D. Warren bellowed while pointing a trembling finger toward the open front door. Seth tried to mutter something about his rights as a guest, but my father stepped forward with such intensity that the younger man scrambled to gather his belongings without another word. Warren made it very clear that he had already contacted a friend in the local police department who was ready to file trespassing charges if the house was not cleared within 5 minutes. The strangers who had been mocking my home just an hour ago were now tripping over each other in their haste to escape the fury of a man who had reached his breaking point. I stood beside my father with my arms crossed while watching the people who had treated my sanctuary like a trash heap flee into the humid Georgia night. Hazel tried to grab my arm while crying about how I was being unfair, yet I pulled away with a cold stare that told her our sisterly bond had been permanently severed by her own greed. Every weak excuse she offered was met with the cold reality of the video footage that was still playing on the smartphone my father held up for her to see. She watched herself on the screen, mocking my weight and plotting to steal my savings while the realization of her total defeat finally began to sink into her mind. Seth was already standing on the porch with his single suitcase while he waited for Hazel to follow him into the uncertain future they had created for themselves. My father did not blink while he watched the last of the intruders leave the premises before he turned his attention back to the mess they had left behind. We stood in the silent living room together, while the weight of the last 3 weeks finally began to lift from my shoulders because the nightmare was over. I knew that the next few hours would be difficult as we cleared out the remaining trash, but the power had finally shifted back into the hands of the rightful owner. Warren placed a heavy hand on my shoulder while he promised that we would fix everything together before the sun came up. That very night, the self-proclaimed owner of the house was reduced to absolutely nothing, shivering in the cold night air of Savannah. I watched as Hazel scrambled to shove her expensive clothes into her suitcases, while Warren stood by the door with his arms crossed and a stopwatch in his hand. I stood next to the fireplace while watching Seth drag his belongings onto the porch without looking back at the woman he claimed to love so much. My father remained perfectly silent while his presence alone forced them to move faster than they ever had during their 3-week stay. Once the 15-minute deadline expired, Warren personally escorted them to the edge of my property and watched until they disappeared into the darkness of the street. I locked the front door for the final time that evening while a profound sense of relief washed away the tension that had occupied my chest. The house felt strangely large and quiet without their constant arguing and the deafening music that had become a nightmare. The very next morning, I contacted a professional locksmith who arrived before 8 o'clock to replace every single exterior lock on my house. I also invested in a high-definition doorbell camera and motion sensors for the backyard to ensure that no one could ever approach my sanctuary without being recorded. Warren stayed with me while the technicians worked because he wanted to be absolutely certain that his daughter was safe from any further harassment. We spent the afternoon cleaning the living room while we threw away the ruined rugs along with the empty bottles that the intruders had left behind. I had to scrub the surfaces of my kitchen counters several times to remove the grime that Seth and Hazel had neglected for weeks. My home finally began to smell like lavender and fresh air again instead of stale beer and desperation. The harsh reality of her situation hit Hazel within 48 hours after she realized that Warren was serious about cutting off her financial support. She began sending me dozens of desperate text messages from unknown numbers while she begged for a loan to cover her mounting credit card interest. Hazel had spent years relying on the generosity of others, which left her completely unprepared for the world of adult responsibilities and independent living. She claimed that she was sleeping in a cheap motel and that her phone was dying while she pleaded for one last chance to prove herself. Seth apparently abandoned her within days when he realized that she no longer had access to my house or my bank account for his business dreams. She was now facing her student loans along with her high-interest debts without a single person willing to bail her out of the hole she had dug. I chose to block every single new number that appeared on my phone because I was finally finished with being the victim of her emotional blackmail. There would be no heartfelt reconciliation or second chances this time, since her spoken words had revealed exactly how little she valued my existence as a sister. I moved forward with my life while focusing on my career and my own well-being, instead of carrying the heavy burden of her constant failures. My home in Savannah is once again a place of peace and productivity, where I can live without the fear of being exploited by my own flesh and blood. Protecting my boundaries was the most difficult thing I have ever done, but it was also the most rewarding choice for my future sanity. Before finishing today's story, I want to take a moment to reflect on the deeper meaning behind Bridget's difficult journey. Don't skip this part, because the choices we make regarding our family can define the quality of our entire lives for years to come. This is not just about a messy house or a stolen steak, but about the fundamental necessity of self-respect within toxic family dynamics. The real problem isn't Hazel's laziness or her boyfriend's arrogance, but the dangerous assumption that blood relations grant people a license to exploit your hard work. The lesson we must take away from this experience is that your home should always be your sanctuary and never a breeding ground for entitlement. If you are in a similar situation, you should establish clear boundaries early, because allowing small violations of your peace will only invite larger betrayals. Remember that someone who mocks your value behind your back does not deserve a seat at your table, regardless of your shared history. You must realize that financial independence is your greatest weapon against manipulation, since it allows you to walk away from toxic environments without fear. Remember that being a good person does not mean you have to be a carpet for others to walk on while they ruin your life. So if you were in Bridget's situation, would you have waited for a camera to catch the truth? Or would you have acted much sooner? Share your views in the comments while we discuss protecting ourselves from parasites. Please, do not forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more stories.